This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what we think is going to be a very interesting show. And we're going to look at building a best-in-class compensation committee. And I have two experts with me that I'm going to be happy to have as guests on the show today. And furthest away, let me introduce Jonathan Foster, who's the comp chair with Chemtura and also sits on the board of the Lear Corporation. And to my immediate left is Stephen Hall, who is the founding partner and managing director of Stephen Hall and Partners. And his firm is a totally independent compensation consulting firm specializing exclusively in the areas of executive compensation, board remuneration, and related corporate governance issues. So welcome, Jonathan and Steve.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Well, as you both know, both of you are going to be part of our program that's coming up in January in Miami, the boot camp for compensation committees. And the theme around that is sort of making sure that we look at the attributes for building a best-in-class committee. So what we're going to do today is we're going to just sort of cheat on that a little bit and take a look at some of the issues relative to that, and then when we have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the boot camp. But Jonathan, since you're the one that's in the trenches, I think we'll start with you. And what would you say if I asked you what the three critical attributes of a best-in-class compensation committee, what are the things that would come to mind for you?
First of all, needless to say, is a good understanding of the company and the industry in which it competes. That sounds obvious, and it is obvious, but it's important to make sure you do it and keep current with both the company and its industry. Second is to have a really good working relationship with the management team, and also a respectful and, let's say, cooperative relationship with the shareholders, which all leads to the third, which is, needless to say, what all compensation committees have to do and should do, which is put together a transparent, easy to understand, and effective compensation program for rewarding long-term performance.
So Steve, you have the opportunity to look at this from a slightly different angle. Yep. You're the consultant that gets called in that all the comp committees need to use. So if I ask the same question to you, from your perspective, what are those critical attributes that you feel are sort of the best in class?
Well, I think you can start with, you can look at the items that Jonathan has mentioned, they're critical. When I kind of walk in and start, there are several different things I like to look at. Number one is the process that's being used. You know, if we don't know how often we're having meetings, how material is being distributed, what it should look like, what we're trying to cover at different times, we're going to be lost. So I think process is very important. I think secondly, making sure we have knowledgeable compensation committee members. We often get executives put on the directors, executives put on the comp committee who haven't necessarily been current with what's been happening. So attending classes, maybe even something like the boot camp that we're talking about, is a great opportunity to not only learn what's going on, but share experiences with other directors as to what's going on. So knowledge, I think, is real important. And third is kind of overlaps with what Jonathan said. It's making sure you understand what the goals and objectives of the company are so that you can tailor the comp program to support those goals.
Yeah, it's interesting because you really don't want to create, you know, a lot of times you'll see in companies where they say they're customer driven, yet the goals that they reward and incentives that they reward and people are for their having a good audit.
Yep.
Okay,
yep.
So there's a place where somebody's got to take a step back and make sure that things are in form and structure with each other.
Yeah, and also not getting yourself overly worked up. I think you have to be concerned with groups like ISS and shareholder advisory groups, but the first thing you've got to start with is what's important to our company and its goals.
Yeah. Steve, you know, we're in such a time of transparency where, and particularly the audit committee these days, And I think a lot of that has to do with sort of the say on pay has really sort of revolutionized the idea that the shareholder can have a pretty big say into what's going on. And it's supposed to be a non-binding sort of advisory vote, but I think we've seen that places that have failed better be prepared to respond. Even not failing, just having a poor percentage, better be able to respond. But what do you think with that transparency is sort of the biggest challenge if somebody wants to stay sort of best of class?
I think the things that we have to be looking at in terms of, first of all, compensation can no longer be done in a vacuum of a quiet compensation committee making decisions that nobody knows about. So I think utilizing not only the things like the CD&A as part of the proxy statement to tell your story, but tell it quickly in the beginning, and you can elaborate a little bit further on, but a lot of people don't get past 4 pages. And then I think continuous shareholder outreach. I was looking at some numbers this morning. 24% of the companies that failed say on pay this year passed with 90% or greater last year. Nobody saw it coming in a lot of these cases, and that's unimaginable. They should understand that they stand a high risk of failing before they get the failure. And so I think constantly looking at that and looking at their program and polling shareholders to understand what's likely to happen on votes is critical right now.
Yeah, I could see where that would be if you had passed the year before. You're sort of sitting there, as they say, fat, dumb, and happy, thinking that this is going to be a breeze, and all of a sudden, if you haven't done your due diligence, you find yourself in a situation of, like you said, losing the vote.
Well, or worse, it could be that you haven't changed anything. You said shareholders loved my program before; they must love it now. But what happened was your stock price got hammered for some reason on a relative basis, and when ISS came through and did its review, their math said you had to fail.
Yeah. Jonathan, same question to you relative to the transparency, and when you're looking at this and looking at the say on pay, what do you think sort of is what do you think differentiates sort of the best in class in dealing with those issues?
Well, you're certainly right that say on pay has made the compensation results, process, etc. more visible and more under the magnifying glass. But I would also add to Stephen's list, at the same time, to be best in class, you can't be afraid to take a view that's a little bit different. It's not perhaps down the middle of the fairway. 2 quick examples. I see a lot of groups default to paying at the median of a peer group compensation level. I think it's critically important not to be afraid to underpay underperformers and to pay above the median to outperformers. It's hard to do that every year given the complexity of compensation, but over a period of time that should clearly be an example. Don't be afraid to get away from the median. At the same time, we all talk about peer groups a lot. As we know, peer groups are simply meant to be a group of companies with which you compete for talent. Sometimes those are your business competitors, but sometimes they're not. And traditionally, ISS, the leading governance advisory firm, and others have taken a very mechanical view on peer groups. If you're in Windows, compare yourself to the window companies. But oh, by the way, you may be 60% Windows and 40% auto parts. So if you compare yourself just to window companies, that's probably not whom you're competing with for talent. So the second issue, the second example, in terms of not being afraid to take a somewhat non-traditional view is with peer groups. Don't be mechanical, but work with your comp consultants, your management team, and others to really put together the right peer group so you're making the right compensation decisions.
You know, I'm sorry, what you said is great, and having that intestinal fortitude to work through it is important. What's frustrating to me is the first question that should be asked is what's right for the company. The second question should be what is ISS going to say, and too often it's the other way around.
No, that's right, and so the magnifying glass is more powerful today. But the best-in-class compensation committee still make the right decisions for the long-term value of the company, not just to get the 98% approval on the say-on-pay vote in the coming proxy season.
Yeah, I'm sure that the ISS will always have an impact on people's minds of what's happening, but it's interesting to note how even when they oppose certain say-on-pays, that a lot of companies have done very good, Steve, and still going out and convincing the other shareholders that the plan that they have is right for the company.
Last year, 85% of the companies that ISS recommended against passed. Shareholder outreach is critical.
Yeah.
And shareholder outreach early on, I think, is critical.
Don't wait till you file your proxy. You start anticipating well in advance.
Right, and that is an advantage, I think, in many ways of say on pay and the transparency. There are some negatives, clearly, but I think that's one of the important positives. After all, directors simply represent the shareholders. Simple to say, more difficult to execute well.
Well, it's certainly because you have such diverse shareholders. You have pension fund managers that would like you to maybe sell the company tomorrow, and you have a lot of people that are in it for the long haul. So that just makes it inherently challenging to represent all the shareholders. But we know that that's a challenge. But Stephen, you had made mention of something, and I want to ask Jonathan about this, about the importance of the education. One of the reasons that we're all participating in the boot camp is to try and take a deep dive into this best-in-class idea so that we can provide guidance to them. And to me, one of the benefits, Jonathan, that you'll have, not only will you be a speaker, but then you get the opportunity to trade ideas and experiences with other comp committee members that are going to be there. Is that one of the values that you see in attending and taking the time to attend a live event like a boot camp?
Absolutely. I think we forget that most of us who sit on boards tend to sit on the same several boards for a long period of time. Consistency is important. But at the same time, that means you're largely exchanging ideas with the same people about the same companies. And so a boot camp like this is a good time for you to share your thoughts with others, but to hear from different people about different issues in different companies. It's very useful.
And Steve, you have done this
a bunch of times.
Yeah, a bunch of times and a bunch of different formats and whatever. But what would you say to somebody? How best would you tell them to take advantage of an opportunity, like a boot camp where professionals like yourself are there offering advice and then their peers are there as well?
I think it's think about it in advance, prepare in advance. Don't just walk in cold and think you're going to sit and be entertained. You're an active participant. In fact, you're the show. So come in with your questions. Don't be shy in terms of doing it, and share experiences with people. Makes it valuable for everybody.
Yeah. We're getting close on time, but I don't want to leave without you guys sort of passing along some wisdom here. So, Jonathan, I'll start with you. And what advice would you give to all the comp committee board members who are watching the show today as far as advice? If you could pass one thought along to them to take out of this, what would be that thought?
I'd say it would be to remember to keep three things in mind. Be well-informed, be cooperative, and be convincing. And just to touch on each of those for a second, well-informed doesn't just mean reading the board materials and being 30 minutes early for your first committee meeting. It means really taking time between meetings to meet members of the senior management, to visit facilities you haven't seen, all the while making sure the chief executive is okay with that, and really getting to know the company well, broadly, and deeply. What I mean by cooperative and convincing is have an opinion, certainly. You're not the only smart person in the room. And it's, I think, a very undervalued skill as to how to play well on a board, but have a view. At the end of the day, if you can't convince the majority of your colleagues, and ideally all of your colleagues, of your view on something, it won't happen. If you're for a big acquisition, if you want to replace a senior executive, you may be right, but if you can't convince your colleagues, it's not going to happen. So well-informed, cooperative, and convincing.
Steve, I don't know if you can summarize your whole profession into a piece of advice, but I'm going to ask you to try.
Well, I think those are all great situations. In fact, you almost get duplicative. It is, make use of all of the tools that you have available, which may mean you're an outside advisor if you're using one, may mean the internal HR group. Make sure you pull in all of the sources that you can use in order to get data to make your decision, and keep an open mind. And if you're a little bit out of, if you've been a little bit out of the compensation game for a few years, remember that it's changed dramatically, and some of the things that may have been in place 5 or 10 years ago may be dead at this point.
Well, gentlemen, you are two of the resources that are going to be available to those attendees who end up coming to our Compensation Committee boot camp, and where we're going to take a deep dive looking at the Compensation Committee's best in class. It's going to be held in Miami at the Coconut Grove Resort on January 24th and 25th. Now, to Steve's point, there's some things that are going to be interesting features about this. We are actually going to be holding a webinar 2 weeks ahead of time to sort of give preparation information so that people can start thinking through and for sure come prepared. And then following that, because we know we'll have limited time to deal with executive compensation, 2 weeks after, there'll also be a webinar as part of this program to help you with board compensation as well, which we know is always a sensitive topic to talk about. So Jonathan and Stephen, I want to thank you for joining me. We look forward to seeing you in just about 2 months down where we hope it's going to be a little warmer than it is here today in New York. But we thanks you for your participation. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the session. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week when we'll deal with another important topic to make you a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.